Today, we're going to jump into part 2 of agriculture. Yesterday was agriculture in terms of what comes from the soil. Today is agriculture in terms of the animals, animals that we use for meat, animals that we use for eggs and for dairy. So I guess coming from my country with a hamburger, you know, what's really interesting is if we look at this, and I have this picture for a reason, but if you look at this and you think about, okay, what are the animal inputs that went into this? Whether it's potentially animal fat in the dough, whether it's the dairy products that are used in the cheese, whether it's the pork that's used for the bacon, whether it's the beef that's used for the hamburger, how many animal inputs go into every food that we make today? It's absolutely across the board. And I think that interestingly, the hamburger has become iconic for a society that's saturated with meat and other animal proteins. In the US, we consume so much meat. We're going to see that in a little bit. But how many times a day do we eat meat? You know, as chefs, traditionally, it was in the center of the plate. It was the thing that we focused on. It was the most important part of any kitchen. You know, you never took a beginning cook and put them on the meat station. They always cooked vegetables because somehow it wasn't seen as important as meat. And historically, there's some accuracy here because, you know, going back in time, it costs more to make meat. It uses more inputs, and it was a sign of wealth. And of course, going way back in time, it was a complete protein, rich in protein, rich in fat, which, for the hunter-gatherers was amazing. But today we have to rethink this model. It's not sustainable for the world today. And chefs, we tend to perpetuate the existing model. Many times we see vegetarian cooking as less important, maybe even kind of a pain, but you sort of have to do it. Our young generations and the cultures that have perfected vegetarian cuisine, like I mentioned earlier in India, they're really going to be our light forward here, and they're going to be our example. So this is what we're going to tackle today. We're going to look at agriculture, animals as food. So we're going to look at the current industrial model. We're going to look at alternative models. We're going to sort of compare them. And then really, I want to jump into chef strategies. And our chef strategies today are not just going to focus on animal protein, but it's also going to focus a little bit on what we talked about yesterday. It's going to tie it all together, the role of vegetables and the role of meat. So where are we today? This is a nice little graph, if you will, bar graph that sort of you can look at your part of the world and see what's going on in terms of meat consumption per capita. That's really important about per capita here. And you'll notice across the board, it's going up. And, we here in North America, we're leading the way, which is not necessarily a badge of honor, but we are. We consume vast amounts of meat protein. Now, this doesn't show the country by country. And interestingly, if we look at per capita meat consumption on a country-to-country basis, the two lowest ones are India at the very bottom, and then Thailand right above it. On the other end of the spectrum, the highest level of meat producers, the highest one in the world is per capita is Argentina, followed by the US, followed by Brazil. So we tend to eat a lot of protein. And what's also interesting here, now this is, let's tie this back to the first day for a minute and think about a population that is growing substantially, that wants to consume more meat. This is per capita. Now imagine what this bar graph looks like as we add more and more people to the world, and how much meat that represents. It's staggering. And interestingly enough, if we look at the predictions from 2015 to 2030, industrial countries are looking at going from 96 to 100 kilos per person on average. Developing countries, 32 to 38 kilos per person, and transitioning countries, 54 to 60 kilos per person. So the fact of the matter is, we all want to consume more animal protein. That's the problem in a world with more and more people. And the reason for this, one of the reasons, is something called conversion ratios. I know a lot of you know what this is, but essentially it's how much food do we have to feed a how much food do we have to feed an animal so that it grows and produces food. And basically animals that have higher feed conversion ratios, like sheep and beef, require large amounts of inputs, food and water, to produce a relatively small amount of actual finished meat. In other words, if we look at this, beef and sheep should really be considered a luxury product versus some of the other animal sources of protein, which you can see onto the left side of the screen here. So, as we look at the next slides, we're really going to look at kind of the pros and cons, the hidden costs. And we talked about hidden costs yesterday because our current system is basically aligned to give us inexpensive animal food products. But remember that behind all of that is always a series of hidden costs that affect society. So let's take a look at this. So this also kind of talks about, the hamburger here. And remember, going back to how much it takes to actually produce the meat that we want to consume, this is a good way to think about it. Now, this is actually for a 1/4 pound patty of industrial beef. So that's in grams, 125 or so? Am I doing that right? But it's 4 ounces. And for that, we need to put in all of the inputs that you see on the left, which is 6.7 pounds of grain, and forage, just to produce a 1/4 pound of meat. And all of the water, 52.8 gallons of water, and how much land it requires and how much fuel it requires. So when we talk about the fact that something like beef is really kind of a luxury thing, when we think about how often, for instance, in Argentina, Brazil, and the US, how often we're consuming beef, that becomes a huge drain on the world's resources. And of course, it's very disproportionate as we look through the world. Also, I would say that, there's a greenhouse gas issue here that comes from the raising of animals that is actually quite serious and impacts global warming rather substantially. Now, there is sort of this other side to this. Remember, I want to be sure, just like when we talked about agriculture yesterday, it's not always so black and white. And there's, again, there's one way to raise beef, there's another way, and then there's things in the middle. Like, for instance, some people who I know who are ranchers, who are cattle producers, who are doing things, quite sustainably, will tell you that, these animals are going to live on parts of the earth, if you will, where crops don't really grow very well. Grass grows exceptionally well, but you can't harvest grass for food. Therefore, they would say we're actually using land that is perfect for raising animals. And actually, as we'll see later, in that system, it's actually a good thing because those animals are fertilizing the ground around them. They're actually creating a better grass, which also improves carbon sequestration. So it is a positive in some respects when you're pasturing animals. So again, I just want to be sure we understand that, it's not always black and white, but I think we have to spend some time looking at where we are today. And that is that we are in what is, animal mass production. Now, this has not been the way that animals were raised for almost all of human history. This is a very recent change, to very much like we looked at yesterday with industrial agriculture, where we start to look at this as, how do we do this? How do we look at it like a manufacturing person would look at manufacturing a product? And that's very much the way that this is done also. You know, we see this really from kind of the 1930s to 1950s onwards that this grows. So this is a relatively new way of raising animals, which is funny because now it's seen as sort of the norm. But what does it mean? Just like yesterday, it means specialization of product. That means, you know, people are just raising certain animals, and typically in very concentrated productions, so they can absolutely minimize cost and improve efficiencies. These are many times vertically integrated, which means one company tends to own everything from the feed to the slaughter and everything in the middle. And you know, it drives down prices. It does give you consistency. That is the natural result of this. And again, there are kind of economic reasons why this system developed, but I think we have to kind of relook at this today. So here's just an interesting example of where this has gone. Just like in agriculture, where we figured out how to greatly increase the yield of agriculture, we've done the same thing with the animals that we've raised. As you can see, you know, hens produce an average of 83 eggs per year in 1900 and over 300 in the year 2000. Milk production, same thing. You know, they have increased milk production dramatically. How did they do it? It's done through a lot of science. It's done through, you know, and again, science is not negative. I want to be sure that when I say science, it doesn't, you know, seem like something very scary. It's been done through selective breeding, and that's been going on from age immemorial. But there's a better understanding of that today. Feed formulations, you know, and then, you know, lots of other things, like, for instance, you know, artificial light. So you kind of trick the hens into thinking they're kind of laying eggs all the time. And even down to things which, you know, we're going to talk about, you know, things like hormone injections, and also the use of antibiotics, which we'll talk about shortly. So there's, you know, there's things that have been done to make this happen. And I think some of those practices are questionable. So what does it mean for the animals themselves? When we mass produce food, again, we increase the amount of food that's available, and we lower the prices. At the same time, it also has an effect on the animals themselves, because they're, you know, oftentimes like restricted movement. They're not necessarily in their sort of quote unquote natural habitat. They are not able to necessarily perform, you know, their natural behaviors. Many times they're under more stress. And again, you know, things like growth hormones and diets that are not necessarily natural have been effectively applied to the animals. Again, we see them as cogs in an industrial machine. And of course, it has an impact for public health as well. So not only does it have an impact for the animal health, but our own health. And one of the things that has been looked at a lot is the issue of animal waste. What do you do with this? So when you concentrate the raising of animals into a small space, what happens is you have waste products at an unusual concentration level. And what is normally seen as a positive, so for instance, if there are animals walking around on grass and they're, you know, pooping like they do, that's fertilizer. That's good for the ground underneath it. But when you concentrate all the animals, and maybe, like, for instance, the cattle are on cement versus in a field, what happens then is we have huge concentrations of animal waste, which actually then becomes a pollutant. And it effectively pollutes the communities that are around it. Waterways become contaminated. There are, you know, obviously things like E. coli in certain animal waste, etc., and that becomes a real serious health hazard. It's also a health hazard for the people who work there, because what happens is they're exposed to this level of contamination, and that becomes problematic. Also, concentrating animals together, that also is problematic, because what that means is that when one animal becomes sick, then many animals can become sick, and we've had large-scale outbreaks as the result of that. By the way, just jumping back to animal waste for a second, on the first day's presentation, we talked, or maybe it was yesterday, we talked a little bit about those dead zones. Remember that, where we have nitrogen runoff from over fertilization, which goes into the ocean and then effectively kills parts of the ocean because there's no oxygen available for the sea creatures. And waste runoff also does the same thing. So when we have runoff from waste, animal waste in large quantities, that also contributes to the dead zones, just like chemical fertilizers do, as we saw yesterday. In addition to the waste that winds up in waterways, it's not just an issue of bacteria, but we also, there's hormones and there are antibiotics that wind up there as well. None of that is necessarily a positive. Now, I did add a little note here, which is, the other side of this that can be argued is that when we have mass production, we also have the ability to improve the food safety and traceability of the products themselves. Now, that's sort of the other side of the coin, and I think that can be argued both ways, because if you have large-scale outbreaks, etc. So this next slide is something that there's two slides I have on this. I want to just draw attention to this because this is a really, really serious issue that is being addressed, but it needs more attention. And this really came to light a number of years ago as humans started to develop increasingly dangerous strains of bacteria which were antibiotic resistant. And a lot of this can be traced back to what is called low-level antibiotic use in animals. Now, please understand, I'm not talking about if there's an animal that is sick, okay, and you would give it antibiotics like you would a human being to cure it of that sickness, at which point you're not going to be slaughtering the animal, obviously. But this is very different. These are antibiotics that are used and on a very low level. And what that means is it's just kind of put into their feed as a way to kind of keep them healthy. The problem with that repeated exposure to low-level antibiotics is that effectively within the animals, it creates the superbacteria. So it kills off the weak bacteria and only the strongest survive. And then those strongest ones, then they multiply. And then that becomes spread to human beings. And that is a very, very serious issue, because if we lose the ability as human beings to have antibiotics that are effective against the diseases that we get, that's a big problem, because now the doctors have lost a major tool in preventing or in maintaining human health. I've seen statistics, and I'm not really sure that I can verify these, but that 80% in the U.S. of all antibiotics produced were given to animals. 80%. So that's a huge number. Again, I don't know if that's necessarily exactly correct, but it's a lot. So this is just another sort of thing you can look at later, because you will have access to these presentations, just to sort of look, okay, so how does this antibiotic resistance, how does it spread? We create it in the animals, and then how does it get to human populations? And I think this is a good sort of, infographic, which I encourage you to go and take a little more time and look at, just to show how serious this is. And it's something that must absolutely be addressed. And a lot of alarm has been raised about this. So let's sort of transition now into a different model. Not one where we are maximizing the amount of animal products and reducing the cost very, very low, but at the same time, engendering lots of other hidden costs along the way. So let's take a look at what sustainable animal husbandry looks like. And this is going to sound a little bit like yesterday, because, what did we talk about yesterday? We talked about ecologically sound. Does it support the ecosystems that exist on the earth, or is it against them? So is it it's ecologically sound? It's economically viable, and that's something that we, again, at the beginning of the presentation on the first day, I did say that, we don't address head-on the social issues that revolve around food, and there are many, and they're very important. But I think one of the issues we have to look at is, for the farmer themselves. Is this an economically viable profession for them? And how do we make that work? And is it socially just? Are people treated properly? Um, so, for example, if we think about pasture raised animals versus ones that are in confinement and in what's called a CAFO, or a confined operation, what happens? Well, number one, we as chefs, we tend to get products that have better taste. Number one, and that's for me, the chef. The animals experience less stress. They're free to engage in their kind of natural behaviors, and they have lower rates of disease. In addition to that, and we'll see it in a little bit, but pasture-raised animals also can improve the nutrition of the meat itself. So there's a lot of very good positives to doing this. So, again, we're kind of this funny world today where we have something called alternative animal husbandry, which really means going back sort of to where we have been, or incorporating some of those ideas into our modern society. So it's actually not so much alternative, but maybe looking back at what the traditional models were and juxtaposing it to the prevailing industrial model. And what does that look like? It looks like pasture-raised animals that walk around in their environments, that live in their kind of natural environments. It's about diversification. It's about looking at other breeds as opposed to kind of we looked yesterday at monocropping. Well, this is sort of the same idea of raising just one type of animal. These tend to be smaller in scale. They tend to be independently owned and managed, not necessarily. But what we're looking at here is farms that mimic nature versus farms that try to become a manufacturing industrial model. So, going back to this whole idea, and again, I'm spending a little more time on things like beef and lamb and animals that walk around and forage. But, when we think about that, when those are managed properly, these animals that graze or forage outside, improve the ecosystems in which they exist. Their manure builds up fertile soil. We talked a lot about soil health on the first day, or second day, I should say. And their manure doesn't pollute the waterways. So in essence, it actually creates a symbiotic relationship where permanent pasture happens, the grasses, and the rotational grazing, moving the animals around, sequesters the carbon, which helps with global warming. So it is, as we said in the first day, everything is connected. And when we make these decisions, it affects other parts of the quote unquote sustainability equation. So what are the benefits of this? So the benefits, we have healthier animals, of course. We have better tasting food products. Now as chefs, that's kind of where we live. Obviously we are here to make business happen, but we also make business through great tasting food. Healthier food, that's a very interesting thing, because what we've seen is that, for instance, with grass-fed beef, many times it has less fat, it has fewer calories, it has higher levels of omega-3 fatty acids, vitamin E, beta-carotene, etc. So the reality is we're actually creating healthier food. And these animals are not given low-level antibiotics, which, again, is a very, very serious issue. And we're not polluting for our neighbors. So the animals have less stress. We all know that animals that have less stress produce higher quality meat. And we're not using growth-promoting drugs, et cetera, et cetera. So we can see that there are serious benefits. Now, the issue becomes, and this is kind of sort of bringing it back to where we are today, how do we embrace these models of meat production, of dairy production, of egg production, and still take into account the fact that our population is growing and we have to be able to produce more of this? And so you can sort of see the tension that arises. And I bring this up right now because this is going to bring me we're going to revisit this on the very last slide today. So just like in the television business, this is what's going to keep you on the edge of your seats. So there's a lot of benefits to purchasing local food, as we talked about yesterday. We support local farmers. We have, local farmers then have the ability to do a little more of what they want. And a lot of times what we'll see as chefs is their willingness to experiment with different breeds, different characteristics, etc. And for us in restaurants to have that direct producer-consumer relationship, what that helps us to do is to tell a story. It's a source of pride. It's something we put on our menu. And every restaurant is looking for a way to differentiate themselves. Every restaurant is looking for something to say, something about why they're better and they're special. And you can use that through the local connections to the farmers. So menu solutions, this is really interesting because, on the first day we talked about the fact that sustainability is made up of lots of individual small decisions. And I think that these slides, this and the following ones, we're going to see how we bring together agricultural and animal husbandry. And we're also going to reinforce this with more protein discussion on Monday, which is about seafood. But the point is, when we as chefs design a menu, it's really important for us to think about, how can we support local foods? How can we lessen the impact of transportation or energy inputs? How can we do that? Right now, one of the things that is so huge is that we have this movement towards local food. And I don't mean just local, like what's grown locally, but also looking at our own cultures wherever we live. It used to be that everybody looked outside of where they lived. And now we've turned inward, which is such a beautiful thing. And so what we're saying is, well, what does the food in my part of the world look like? And what are those ingredients and heirlooms that I can feature on my menu that not only produce great food, but it also helps me talk about who I am and where I live and why the place where you live is special in the world. So it's important that we look to those heirloom solutions and we support the meat and agriculture from each of these individual parts of the world. That's huge. So let me just go ahead and move on here. So the excuse me. So how do we do this? Part of this is we have to learn. We talked about the first day that knowledge is the incentive of everything. But let's bring this back to reality also. Chefs are busy, and wouldn't it be great if every one of us could visit every one of the farms and talk to the local suppliers? And clearly this is a wonderful thing to do. But how do we really do this in a very busy day in and day out way of living? And I think that there's just a few ideas here that I want to share with you. And you can see that sourcing local foods can be a challenge. Going directly to the farmer, that has its challenges. Local markets, they have their challenges. But where I really want to sort of think about this is, let's think about how to do this with economies of scale. Let's look at the distribution of these products and how we restaurants can support that or even create it. So how can chef societies, how can groups of chefs help move and shape the market and the products that are being produced? Remember, chefs, we have incredible power. We have incredible buying power. I mean, right now, just to give you a sense for how important it is, 70% of the fish that we consume in the US, for instance, is served in restaurants. Well, right now, the restaurants are all closed, and the fishing industry is in serious trouble. We have tremendous power to shape the market around us, but we have to pool our orders together. We have to work together, and we have to share knowledge. So chefs, if you discover something amazing in your area of the world, share it with the people around you, because if we can incentivize the local producer of agriculture or animals to do things that are sustainable and interesting, but on a larger scale, that becomes more interesting for them to do, and may also have impacts on price as well. So remember, People respond to market demand, and we have that power. So menu solutions, we have to use it all. You know, this goes into the last day, which is waste, and how do we avoid waste, and how do we use the product completely? And there's been a lot of talk about, you know, nose to tail, you know, root to plant or whatever, you know, using every bit of it and really thinking about how do we minimize the waste. We're going to get to that on the last day. Remember, it's all interconnected. How do we use those less sought after cuts of meat? And this is really where chefs, we excel at this. We're great at creative solutions. I always say that chefs are the best problem solvers in the world. And that's what we do. But not only do we solve these problems, but we create beautiful food, and we can do it in tandem with systems of production of vegetables and fruit. So let me just sort of move into this, and then we're gonna wrap up here. But how do we do this? You know, I'm going to start to answer that question I posed a little bit earlier about, okay, you know, we can raise animals differently, but how do we do this and still deal with a population that's growing and will require more calories just by the size of the population? And these are some things for us to think about very seriously. Can we create less meat-centric menus? You know, can we make smaller meat portions? Can we make vegetables the star on the plate? Can we be creative about this? Again, what tends to happen traditionally is we spend a lot of energy and time thinking about the animal protein, and then vegetables play a supporting role. Let's flip that around. Let's be leaders. Let's teach the population about the fact that it's not just good for you, but it's delicious. And chefs, frankly, if you think about the plant-based world, is far more interesting and complicated and complex than animal proteins will ever be. So we need to do that. Focus on local plants, embrace flexitarians, and meatless Mondays. There's a lot of things here that we can do. Chefs, we have the power of the white jacket. We have the power to lead. We have the power to show people what they should be doing, and we do it in a delicious way. So don't forget education. Education is critical. And education goes in both directions. I mean, it's what we're doing here, and I commend you for being here. But it's also about educating the farmers and suppliers about what you want and asking those questions. Remember, we have buying power. And at the same time, it's about educating our staff so they know what we're doing and why to be proud of that. And also to educate our guests as to why we're making the decisions we're making. Why are we buying local? Why does that food cost a little bit more, but it's supporting that person? Let me tell you about that person. Or for instance, you know, teaching them about the fact that we're doing a lot more with vegetables and less with meat, and you're gonna love it. And this is why. So I end with this slide, and I would strongly encourage all of you, if you've not looked up and read what the Eat Lancet report came out with last year, I cannot overemphasize how important this publication is. And it really sort of brings together something that a lot of us have been looking at for a long time, which is, it's kind of funny. You know, in culinary schools, we would talk about sustainability on one side and nutrition on the other side. And what we've discovered is that the two are actually one. And this publication does an amazing job of really digging into this and looking at the fact of, you know, how do we take care of our planet? How do we feed ourselves? And how do we do it in a sustainable and nutritious way? And guess what? It is exactly the same thing. And you can see by the planetary health plate in the image there, it's pretty small, I realize. But it really shows what we should be eating. And for many countries in the world, and I'm looking at us here in the United States as well, our diet is so non-sustainable, both from a health standpoint personally and from a planetary health standpoint. So this publication, I commend it to you to read much more about it. Remember, in these short classes, we only scratch the surface of so much of this. Food is complicated, like I said in the beginning. But there's also some great recommendations for chefs here. And these are just a few of the ones that I picked out, which are in the bullet points. You know, we change culture by changing menus. Chefs, we have incredible power. Never, ever, ever underestimate the power you have to change the culture around you. And we do that through the menus and the leadership that we demonstrate. And we can emphasize these benefits of dietary shifts. It's about education. It's about making food absolutely, absolutely delicious. Focus on quality and focus on quality. Typically, it's focus on quality and quantity. No, it's about quality. That's what we do, chefs. It's not about how much, it's about how beautiful and delicious we can make it. And we let the plants take center stage and always lead with messaging around flavor. There's a good friend of mine who runs an organization called Chef's Manifesto, and I think his saying is something like, scream flavor and whisper health. Because when we lead with flavor, we will always get the customer. So I leave you with the last question here, which is, what will you do to change your diet? Remember, it always starts with you and me and what we do individually, and then how we lead. So with that, I want to thank you very much for taking the time once again to be with me today, to share this incredible this incredible global thing that we're doing. So many of you are here. I don't know how many, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. It is absolutely incredible that so many of you take the time. I'm honored by each one of your presence here today.